When we first think of Rear Window, we immediately are reminded of the themes of voyeurism and watching. But I wanted to discuss how these themes are working to get us to think about the process of analysis and the way we make meaning out of literature. We obviously have an interest in the process of analysis. We know this because over the last century of British and American literature, there has been a strong interest in detective fiction, a genre that partially owes its appeal to its ability to portray superhuman analytic abilities. We usually think of Edward Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes when we think of detective fiction, but both actually have their roots in Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin. In Poe's The Murders of the Rue Morgue, what is commonly considered to be the first piece of detective fiction, Dupin displays his superhuman analytical abilities by doing things like tracing the thoughts of the narrator simply by observing the narrator as he walked by Dupin's side. Dupin's abilities and the story that they are featured in are prefaced by a short discussion about analysis. In this discussion, it is noted that it is not the truth of one's observations that make them a good analyst, but rather that they have the, quote, necessary knowledge of what to observe. And this serves as a kind of reminder to say that this level of analytical thinking is impossible to achieve in the real world. This being so, we should be mindful of the fact that none of us, mere mortals, can observe enough to make conclusions with the same accuracy as Dupin does. Advice that I think could have avoided the whole mess of Rear Window altogether. It's undisputed that Rear Window is stressing themes of voyeurism in watching. Stella surely makes these themes explicit when she gives a brief account of her homespun philosophy, one that underlies the entire film, or when she makes sharp quips like,
"Mind if I use that portable keyhole?"
But still, these themes are subtly implied from the very first shots of the film in the way the shots seem to mimic the wordy expositions that we are used to seeing in novels. For instance, the cameras push through Jeffrey's window and the underwhelming scan of the courtyard gives us the impression that we are stepping into a new fictional world, a feeling familiar to that of slowly reading the first scene-setting paragraph of a novel. Moreover, the second shot pans across the courtyard, giving us a sneak peek into the character of each resident, including Jeffries himself. In these shots, Hitchcock is laying the groundwork for the entire film, and more notably, he's doing so without using any dialogue. These two shots act as perfect examples of pure cinema, but more importantly, this sophisticated artistic choice serves a purpose beyond Hitch just showing us how clever he is. Both shots remind us that we, the viewers, are in fact watching. They act as a commentary on what we readers and viewers actually do when we enter a story's universe and familiarize ourselves with it through the story's exposition. By making these shots wordless, Hitch is exposing the fact that when we begin to enter any new fictional world, we are really just peeking, or rather, silently intruding into some foreign world filled with foreign people. Now, there was a lot I wanted to talk about for this project, but I chose to focus on how subtle details, like the ones just mentioned, encourage us to liken Jeffrey's voyeuristic behaviors to the acts of reading fiction or watching a movie. With this reading in mind, I'll try to show that Rear Window is attempting to make numerous comments concerning the practice of analysis. The one I'll try to argue for here is that Hitch is trying to show us that our methods of analysis are much less dependable than we usually believe. One way Hitch encourages us to view acts of voyeurism as a process of reading is by distinguishing objects of watching as separable entities, and then imposing limitations on the information we can gather from them. By doing this, Hitchcock exaggerates the way in which we piece together elements of a narrative to form a cohesive story. By object of watching, I mean whatever it is Jeffries is looking at a particular moment. These objects are, quite literally, separated in space by appearing within the borders of a window. Windows are clearly being used to frame each character in their natural environment, in the same way a character frames a movie scene. In doing so, the object of watching appears as a self-contained snapshot that gives us an impression of what's going on in the scene, much like the prose vignette does. My favorite little vignette has to be a little shot into the songwriter's apartment during his party. At a quick glance, we see the party is contained within the windows. However, the image doesn't merely signal that there's a party going on. Rather, outlined by one window pane is the songwriter, taking a break from his piano to get the coffee that'll get him through the rest of the night. Two panes to his right is an older couple rekindling their love in the corner, and within the window as a whole is a room full of guests half drunkenly singing along to a sentimental tune. Here, we see that the window is working as a container for all of these elements. In that container, they work together to give us the pointed impression of a party that has just spilled over the moment of climax. By offering numerous shots that leave such complicated and quickly felt impressions, Hitch encourages us to recognize that each simple object of watching can exist on its own, apart from the narrative that we're most invested in. While we do always have access to the object we're watching, since we are looking at it after all, still we probably won't be able to see everything within the frame that the object appears in, thus limiting our ability to understand the impression that is contained within it. A good instance of this comes early in the film when Jeffries takes a look at a terrace and sees two women come outside. They quickly drop out of sight and become hidden within the frame. Shortly after, only their shirts become visible as they fling them across the railing. From this shot, we can still get an impression that indicates what it'd be like to be one of those sunbathing women from the scene, but because the naked women are hidden within the frame, we have to rely on reason to arrive at this impression. In other words, the impression has to be inferred. No, Hitch wants us to pick up on this because just after we're denied the uncut impression to be had from the previous scene, we cut to the uncensored, sexualized scene of Miss Torso dancing in her apartment, as if it were some sort of consolation prize to Jeffries, I suppose. Throughout the film, Jeffries, Doyle, and even Lisa explicitly look at Miss Torso and show not the least bit of shame for it either. Miss Torso's sexy dancing and popularity suggests that she is some perfect embodiment of the heteronormative ideals of femininity and female sexuality. That's just to say that she's not really viewed as a person, but rather as a well-understood type. Since we all supposedly appreciate Miss Torso and her impromptu performances, there's no pressure for her to ever really be shy. She can dance as she does, freely and in plain view, ultimately allowing us to effortlessly comprehend the impression her frame has to offer. When viewed in contrast to the censored terrace scene, Miss Torso's scene appears to stand out for its liberal sexual exposure. This tension between revealing and concealing seems to be encouraging us to think about how some impressions, like Miss Torso's, are made explicitly, while others, like the two women's, are merely inferred by our imaginations. It's kind of funny, but fitting to see Jeffries lose interest in Miss Torso relatively quickly and simply look away, bored. Again, this reaction shows that these two scenes are set against each other, but it adds a level of complexity to it. While Jeffries merely dozes away from Miss Torso, we may remember that a helicopter had to shoo Jeffries' glare away from the terrace, causing him to look away with a look of shame on his face. This difference in holding Jeffries' attention seems to suggest that content isn't all that keeps our attention. Sure, sex appeal may grab our attention in some cases, but that feeling of unease, of mystery, that feeling that's created when we're withheld from the full impression of a scene is what really makes us want to stick around. We stay interested in these kinds of scenes up until that very moment we're kicked out because we want to see if the inferences we make about this scene hold water. We want to see if we'll be granted the access needed to experience that impression. So we know every object of watching becomes a cinematic sort of vignette. We also know that some impressions are communicated more explicitly than others. The reason this is important is because I believe this process of forming impressions closely resembles the way we make our way through a movie or novel. It is the case in every story that at each point we're presented a new mini-scene, and from these we gather some impression. In every piece of fiction, we have to rely on the impressions that we've collected and then piece them together to make meaning out of the parts that create the cohesive story. Rear Window mainly revolves around the Thorwald narrative. Thorwald's behaviors certainly proved to be the most mysterious, and this is why Jeffries was set on uncovering the true story behind those behaviors. Again, Thorwald's behaviors were viewed as vignettes just as any other behaviors were. This means that Jeffries had to make a lot of inferences in order to come away with a meaningful understanding of the impression that Thorwald's scenes had to offer him. Since there were so many inferences that Jeffries had to make, there was a lot of places for him to go wrong. By introducing Thorwald's narrative in the fragmented way that it is, it puts Jeffries in the position of a detective and an English professor at the same time. Not only does he have to solve the mystery, but he can only do so by making assumptions based off of the text that he's given. The fact that Jeffries' reading of Thorwald's narrative is continually challenged suggests that Hitchcock found some clear problems with this method of analysis. By having Doyle challenge his analysis with intellect, and by having Thorwald challenge it with physical force, the movie suggests that the lack of stability that is inherent in this type of literary analysis leaves something to be left to be desired. Yet, I don't think Rear Window is merely supposed to be a cautionary tale of the dangers of literary analysis. I think we see these literary-like conditions in real life also. For instance, when we first meet someone, the encounter could be likened to the experience of reading a vignette. That being the case, the person's character or identity would be that thing we are trying to understand by piecing together the fragmented objects. Ultimately, I think the film is a callback to Poe. At the very end, when we find out that we couldn't possibly have predicted any of the characters' fates, even though the impressions we had of them were so strong and clear. By pulling the rug out from under us at the end, Hitch ultimately confirms Poe's idea that says that it isn't the truth of what we see, but what we actually do and don't see. Personally, I think that Jeffries is finally sleeping because he's finally learned that he is no Dupin. He can finally rest, even though he had to learn to take Poe's advice the hard way.